Thank you. Thank you very much, Anita, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for being here when it's so nice outside. So this book, Gun Island, it's narrated by a protagonist called Deen Datta, but he's settled in Brooklyn, and he's Americanized his name to Dean. He's a rare book dealer, but you know, he still has sort of connections with his birthplace, Calcutta or Kolkata, and he goes back there every now and again to see his family. And one year, while he's back in Kolkata visiting his family, he hears about a temple to Monasha Devi in the jungle of the Sundarban. Monasha Devi is the goddess of snakes and all venomous creatures. So Monasha Devi is a very interesting figure in the folklore of Bengal, and I'm myself Bengali, so it's something that interests me a great deal. Monasha Devi, she figures in this famous legend in Bengal, where she has this kind of very tormented relationship with a merchant who's known literally as the merchant. And she wants to convert this merchant, she wants to make this merchant into a disciple, but the merchant resists. And so she pursues him with snakes and calamities of all kinds, you know, terrible storms and droughts and famines and disasters of all kinds. And finally, he escapes abroad. But even there, she pursues him, and in the end, he returns to Bengal as she wants. And you know, he builds temples to her. So Dean, when he hears about this temple, he's always had an interest in this legend. He's a guy who worked as a folklorist. So he has worked on the texts about the snake goddess, and his thesis was that most of these texts are written in the 17th century. And so it kind of excites him when he hears this temple is out there in the jungle. He decides to go and visit this temple to see, you know, what sort of temple it is. Now, I don't know if all of you know about the Sundarban, or the Sundarban as it's called. It's this enormous mangrove forest in the southern part of Bengal. And I'd written an earlier book called The Hungry Tide, which is also set in the Sundarban. So this book just begins in the Sundarban. But the Sundarban, you know, mangrove forests are very unlike any other kinds of forests because they're very, it's just mud and trees, but it's very beautiful in its own way, but these are tidal forests, you know, like you have in the Everglades. So he goes there, he goes to the Sundarban to see this, to visit this temple. And on the way there, he's taken there by a young man called Tipu. Tipu is you know, he's a sort of very Americanized young fellow who's very good at dealing with technology of various kinds. But Tipu takes him to the temple, and there they're planning to meet up with a caretaker who's also a young man, a young fisherman. But the caretaker isn't there. So Tipu leaves Dean at the temple and goes away to look for the caretaker. And in the meantime, Dean is looking around the temple. So I'm going to read to you a little bit of his response to the temple. The building wasn't large, no bigger than the familiar thatched huts of the Bengal countryside, and time had not been kind to it. Yet the structure was so unexpected and so lovely that the sight fair took my breath away. The roof had the convex outline of an upturned boat, and it was this, I guess, that placed the temple within the context of a Bishnupuri style of architecture. Nor was that very surprising, for everything about the structure, its burnt sienna color, the shape of the roof, and the panels on its facade, spoke of Bengal's most celebrated style of architecture, which had originated in the kingdom of Bishnupur in the 17th century. So there he is, he's looking at this temple, and He's kind of enchanted by it. So caught up was I in thinking about the shrine's exterior that it was almost as an afterthought that I wandered through the arched gateway that led to its interior. It was very dark inside, and it seemed even more so because of the contrast with the bright mid-morning sunlight outside. But as soon as I had stepped past the gateway, I knew from the echoing of my bare feet that I was in a cavernous, domed hallway of a kind that is characteristic of this style of architecture. As I was looking around, I became aware of a low, growling sound somewhere behind me. I spun around, thinking that a dog had followed me inside. But no, framed in the arched gateway was the face of a shaggy-haired boy who was staring at me in what seemed to be utter disbelief. Who could this be but the much-awaited Rafi, the caretaker? I was so delighted to see him that I hurried eagerly towards the entrance, crying out loudly, "Etto, here you are. I've been waiting for you." He began to back away fearfully as I approached, and this did not entirely surprise me. I was, after all, a stranger, possibly an intruder. But still, his response was so excessive as to be almost amusing. He seemed to be seized by utter eye-popping terror, as though I was some kind of monster. "I'm just a visitor," I said. "I've come from Kolkata." But this did not stop the boy's retreat. He continued to back away from me until his withdrawal was halted by the rim of a well. There at last he came to a standstill. Dropping his eyes, he began to breathe heavily, as if in relief at a narrow escape. He looked to be in his late teens, with a lightly feathered upper lip and long, supple limbs. "I seem to have caught you by surprise," I said. "You're Rafi, aren't you?" He nodded and straightened himself. "And who are you?" he said. I noticed that his Bengali accent was marked with the rustic lilt of the Sundarbans. "What are you doing here all by yourself?" So he goes on to ask him about the temple, but Rafi is kind of, he kind of resists answering his questions because he doesn't sort of believe in the legend behind the temple and so on. So, Deen tries to persuade him that, to talk about the temple, but he doesn't really want to. And in the end, Deen sort of gives up and he says, "You're right," I said, humoring him. "And it's obvious, isn't it, that this temple has nothing to do with Manasha Devi, the goddess of snakes?" Rafi's long-lashed eyes glinted as if in puzzlement. "Why?" he said. "Why do you say that?" "Because," I said, "if Manasha Devi had anything to do with this place, surely there would be a snake around here, wouldn't there? A cobra." I glanced at him again and saw, to my surprise, that his face had gone rigid. He was staring fixedly at me now, with a hand over his mouth. "What's the matter?" I said. Slowly, his hand fell away from his mouth. "But there is," he whispered. "There is what?" "There is a cobra inside the temple. It's been there many years." It was my turn now to stare in disbelief. "Impossible," I said. "I went inside the temple. I didn't see anything." "It was right behind you," he said. "When you came out of the temple, I could see it behind you. Its hood was raised and its head was above your shoulder. I've never seen it like that before. It never comes out when I'm here, and I leave it alone too. It keeps other snakes and animals away. I never go in there. You must have disturbed it when you went in." "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, it's not possible." At that moment, I was absolutely certain that he was joking or deluded. It was simply unimaginable that I had stepped into a cobra's lair. Such things just don't happen to people like myself. Reclusive antiquarians who spend most of their waking hours staring at screens and old books? No. At this point, we were at one of the temple's far corners where the facade joined the compound's surrounding wall. From that angle, almost nothing was visible of the building's interior, except the arched entrance and the darkness inside. My incredulity at what I had just heard was such that my feet began to move of their own accord. Before I knew it, they had brought me face to face with the entrance, so that I could confirm with my own eyes that everything was as I had thought. And then suddenly there it was, appearing out of the darkness like a whiplash, rearing up as if it had been waiting for me, the intruder, to show himself again. Staring at it now, at a distance of only a few feet, I realized that it was no ordinary cobra, but a king cobra, a hamadryad, of a size such that its upraised head was level with mine. Its tongue flickered as I looked into its shining black eyes, and I became aware of a growling sound. I would learn later that this species does not hiss, but emits this other sound instead. I stood frozen, as if welded to the ground. Yet, although it was well within reach of me, I'm convinced to this day that the cobra would not have harmed anybody if not for what came next. Unbeknownst to me, Tipu had arrived at the compound's gate moments earlier and had observed the scene as it was unfolding. Imagining that I was about to be attacked, he had snatched up a fishing net and crept stealthily into the courtyard. And it was only when the net was cast at the cobra that I became aware of Tipu's presence. And it was then, too, that the creature struck with astonishing speed and power. Even as the net was descending over its hood, it flung itself at Tipu and succeeded in striking him with one fang just above the elbow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cobra was gone and the net was lying empty on the ground. Tipu was on his knees, hunched over his elbow, staring at the wound on his arm. Then he slowly crumpled to the ground and looked straight into my eyes. What do I do now? He said in a whisper. So Tipu was kind of lucky, actually, because king cobra is a very powerful and extremely venomous animal. I mean, a king cobra, they're famously persistent. When they rarely attack human beings, but when they do attack, they're very, very persistent. But this is a very strange incident because the king cobra obviously wasn't intending to attack him, so it only pumps a very little bit of venom into him. A king cobra can actually kill an elephant if it wants. I mean, they've been known to hold on to an elephant and just empty all their venom into the elephant, and the elephant dies. But Tipu gets away, and Deen returns to Brooklyn, and then many sorts of peculiar and uncanny incidents bring them back together. First in the US, and then finally in Italy. So the last part of the book is actually set in Venice and in Italy. So I'm going to stop here because now we're going to have a discussion with Rajiv. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll get to questions for Amitav in a minute, but I also wanted to express my thanks to the Sinha family for their generous support, and to the Chicago Humanities Festival and the Alice Kaplan Center for the Humanities also for their support. And to Amitav for writing, you only got to hear a very short excerpt, but it's an extraordinary novel. For those of you who haven't read it, I urge you to pick up a copy and read the whole thing. So first, those are my thanks. Second, I want to wish everyone a happy Diwali. Today's Diwali. Yeah, so let's just jump right into it. I was not complaining, but I was apologizing in advance to Amitav that I haven't done this sort of event very often before, so I'm not very good at it, I'm afraid. But the other dilemma that an event like this presents is that some people, like me, have read the new novel and know some of his earlier work, but I suspect many of you have not read the new novel. So the challenge for me was to try to tailor my questions to things that would not give away spoilers to the novel or be too anchored in details of the novel, but still might produce a lively discussion. So with that, I wanted to start by asking you, the people who have read the novel and those who know your work, probably, as I did when I read the novel, will have a sneaking suspicion that in some ways this novel, in which climate and the climate crisis looms so large throughout the plot, in fact, to the point that it's almost a character hovering over the entire plot of the novel, that it seems like, to me anyway, that this is your attempt to put into practice something that you called for in an earlier work, The Great Derangement, which came out a few years ago. It's a longish essay in book form about the sort of the failure of the humanities to grapple with the enormity of the climate crisis. And I wonder if you could tell the audience a bit about the connection between those two works, if there is one.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me also, I'd love to, to thank Prabha and Anita for supporting these events, and really for supporting so much, so many other things. For example, the Art Institute in Chicago as well. And, you know, it makes it such a hospitable place for us to come to. Now, you know, my book, The Great Derangement, really began as a series of lectures at the University of Chicago. They were the Berlin lectures, and you know, then they were published. I wrote those lectures in 2014, 2015, because I mentioned this, the Sundarban. The Sundarban, you know, it's a mangrove forest, so it's extraordinarily vulnerable to sea level rise. And when I wrote my earlier book about the Sundarban, this was The Hungry Tide. I started researching the book back in the year 2000. And in places like the Sundarban, as in the Arctic, in these very, very vulnerable places, you get to see the impacts of climate change very clearly. You know, you get to see the sort of effects that sea level rise is having upon people. You see how salt water is coming deeper and deeper inland. You see how previously fertile lands are being swamped. And I'm from Bengal, and Bengal is one of the most crowded places on earth. You know, it's 250 million people living in a place that's really smaller than Texas. And, you know, most of Bengal is within 1 meter of sea level. So even a small sort of rise in sea levels really, you know, is going to displace millions and millions of people. So, you know, these realities became evident to me at that time, and I've been thinking about it, following all this stuff very closely. And in 2009, there was a major hurricane, which we call cyclones, in this region, displaced a lot of people, just permanently disrupted, you know, in the same way as we've recently seen in the Bahamas. You know, the death toll was fortunately not very high in the Bahamas, but you can be sure that the people will not be able to return to their homes because the long-term effects of a hurricane of that kind are so profoundly devastating. So all those issues were very much on my mind, and I kept wondering, you know, I look around myself, I look at this changing reality that we live in, and why are more writers not writing about it? You know, why are we pretending we still live in some mid-20th century world where everything was predictable? So that's how those lectures began. But I would say really that, you know, my book is just an attempt to do what I feel I've always done, which is to respond in a creative way to the realities of our time. And these are the realities of our time, which is why, you know, they figure in the book.
Yeah, thank you. But, well, to follow on that, I mean, as much as climate looms in the plot of the novel, I don't want to give anything away, but it isn't just a climate novel in the sense that, you know, you're not just sort of saying, hey, we should all pay more attention to the climate crisis. That's clearly an important motif in the book. But one of the interesting threads, or you could say maybe undercurrents actually is the right metaphor, that runs through the novel is the way that you try to kind of destabilize seemingly sharp distinctions between categories like modern versus pre-modern, or reason versus religion, or spirituality, you could say, science and superstition, empiricism versus affect, rationalism versus intuition. In other words, you seem to be making a much bigger argument that there's something deeper about how so many of our modern / civilized biases are actually barriers to understanding. I don't know if this question makes sense if you haven't read the novel, but given that the theme of the festival this year is power, I wonder if you could say maybe a bit about the role of the power of intuition plays in the novel. We got a tiny glimpse of it in the selection that you read. But
first of all, I would say straight away that this is certainly not a climate change novel. I completely disown
I told them I'm not good at this. So.
Any such label. And the reason I disown it is because, that is a kind of genre. And it's, as with all genres, it brings its own expectations. And, such novels are usually about the future, and they're about the dystopias of various kinds. Whereas my book is absolutely about the present. And if anything, it's about the links between the past and today. And in those links, I think one of the periods that really interests me is the 17th century, which is the last time that the Earth went through this great sort of climatic tribulation. But in that case, it was a reverse greenhouse effect. That is, temperatures fell by 1 or 2 degrees. Whereas what we are heading for is much, much worse. But what we do see from that period, what we do see from the Ice Age, is that humanity is actually much, much more vulnerable to climate impacts than we imagine. Because in the 17th century, a small drop in temperature led to absolute mayhem around the world. It led to, civil war in England, terrible wars breaking out across Europe, the 30 Years' War. In China, the Ming dynasty fell with absolute bloodshed everywhere. I mean, in fact, if you look at the 17th century and what came out of it, it's absolutely blood-curdling, and if you think that what lies ahead for humanity today, it's a very, very frightening scenario. And, I personally think that we have to look backwards. We have to look backwards in time to understand, where we are headed.
Yeah, but not to disagree, but well, I think as I read it, one of the most powerful things that jumps out in the narrative is the way in which you create a sort of global narrative in which, climate change and the threat of it is not something that just happens out there in, exotic places like the Sundarban, but also in Venice and New York and Los Angeles. And so another of the striking things about the novel is that it would be easy to kind of pigeonhole it as, an Anglo-Indian novel or a Bengali novel, but it's really a global novel. I mean, Strasbourg, North Africa, East Africa, all over the Indian Ocean, all of these places, Finland even, figure into the plot in some way or the other. But by the same token, at the very narrow local level, I was struck also, and this may be too narrow a question, but so many of your Bangladeshi characters refer to themselves as Bengali, which of course at one level is perfectly ordinary and natural, as it should be, but it's a potent reminder that the partition of the subcontinent and the division into these nation states is so recent still. I mean, my own father was born in British India. We're Punjabis, so we experienced these things on the other side of the subcontinent, but I wonder if you could say a bit about that history and how it figures into the movements of your characters and the relationships between the characters for, a kind of non-South Asian audience.
Sure. Well, we live in a world that's inescapably global today. We all know that. And in fact, I mean, that's what causes us so much fear and often discontent. You know, I mean, the insistent sort of globalism of the world that we live in. And this is a phenomenon that extends really across the planet. You know, a large part of this book comes out of sort of experiences that I had in 2015, 2016 of the European refugee crisis, the so-called refugee crisis. Because I noticed, you know, in those pictures of people crossing the Mediterranean in those rickety boats, we've always told that most of those people were Arabs or Afghans or sub-Saharan Africans. But I could see, when I looked at those pictures, I could see that many of the faces of the people who were crossing the Mediterranean, that many of them were South Asian. And I could actually recognize that many of these guys were actually Bangladeshi or Bengali. So I became very intrigued by this, and I went to Italy, and I spent a long time visiting refugee and migrant camps, and you know, talking to migrant bodies of various kinds and volunteers and so on. And that was a really eye-opening thing for me to see, you know, this huge numbers of people leaving South Asia, Bangladeshis as well as a lot of Pakistanis, and not quite so many Indians. And you know, the experiences that they go through, because these experiences are actually mind-boggling, you know. They fly from Bangladesh into Libya, where often they're enslaved, and you know, they have these terrible, terrible lives. And then finally, you know, getting into those boats and crossing those boats, the sorts of dangers that they encounter, it was a completely revelatory thing for me to realize, because you know, you mentioned the globalism. The thing is that these movements are made possible in large part by technology, and that is by the cell phone. You know, every migrant, basically their movements are made possible through cell phones. The payments to the traffickers, the destinations, where they're going, all of it is completely tied to this technology.
I'm checking how much time we have. I wanted to ask you about your use of language. I mean, so many of your novels have such a rich and colorful language and use of language and playfulness with language, and this novel too. One hears Bengali, one hears Italian, one hears American accented English, one hears all of these sort of things. But I wanted to ask you, this is maybe way too narrow, but I can't not ask you about the character Sinta, who, without giving anything away, is a very important character in the novel, arguably one of the most important characters in the novel. But as I was reading it, I was in my head mispronouncing her name. I was in my head pronouncing it Cinta, partly because I don't know Italian, so I thought maybe that's how it's pronounced. But then I heard parts of the audiobook where it's pronounced Sinta, and is it supposed to be Cinta?
Yes.
Okay, so I was right. You should tell the audiobook people it's pronounced Sinta. It's really confused me. But the other part of this is that, so I don't actually know what Cinta means in Italian, but in Hindi, of course, it means thought, it means reflection. But it also can mean anxiety or anxiousness. And, you know, her character, you know, reflects both of those things. So I guess my question is actually answered.
Yeah, well, Cinta, which is actually short for Giacinta, which is hyacinth. But Cinta is quite a common name in Italian. I mean, Cinta itself just means belt or girdle, or, you know. But in this case, it's just a diminutive for Giacinta. So she is half American, actually half Midwesterner, from Tennessee, and half Italian. Her father is Venetian, and she grows up in Venice, and she becomes a a historian of Venice, a sort of very major historian of Venice. So she's a very important presence in the book. To me, she was really the central character in the book. And you know, she's a very learned scholar and so on. But she's also, I mean, I found her completely fascinating for myself. But I should explain that at the heart of this book, there's an etymological mystery. And I think that's what you and I have in common. That's an interest in etymologies, you know. And in this case, the etymological mystery centers on a Perso-Arabic word, which is a banduk. Banduk was a word that was very commonly used by English people in India in the 19th century and so on. So it actually found its way into the Oxford English Dictionary. So it counts as an English word, really. But it just means gun, banduk. But it comes from the Arabic bandukiyya, which in turn, you know, has Greek roots. So anyway, I'm not going to give all that away. But this etymological mystery is really at the center of this book, and Chinta is quite critical to it.
I was going to ask you about that if the occasion arose, but so now I will, without talking about banduk, because it figures so, it's such a striking moment in the novel but the other part of that is that, you know, much of the plot of the novel figures around unraveling the legend of this gun merchant, the Banduki Sadagar. So part of it is banduk, which means gun, but the other part of it is Sadagar. And, you know, similar to this kind of weird, I don't know if the multilingual pun with Chinta was intentional, but with Sadagar, there's also, for those who don't know, it comes from Persian, Saudagar, and Sauda, on the one hand, just means trade, commerce, etc. So a saudagar is a merchant or trader. But sauda with a hamza at the end is a very subtle distinction, but with a hamza at the end means black bile, which in the humoral theory produces love, passion, and in other words, an abundance of it, but could also be madness, a kind of madness or melancholy. And so as I was reading, I was wondering if this was intentional or not.
Well, you know, there are all kinds of themes that come together through words and unusual words. I'm always fascinated by, you know, words and their histories and how they knit things together. So yeah, that was one very fun part of the book.
Do we have time for one more, or do we need to? Oh, okay. We have plenty of time. You've alluded to it already, but I wanted to ask about the research for the novel. It's clear that some of the characterization and so forth is autobiographical, just from things I know about you anyway, but things you've written about before of your autobiography. But there's also so much rich historical detail, and you just answered one of my questions, which is that you traveled to Venice, but other places like Los Angeles and Strasbourg that figure in the plot, I mean, the details are so concrete and vivid that they seem like you traveled there. But then also the meditations on 17th century connections between the Indian Ocean world and the Mediterranean are, I mean, I could give them to my global history students and say, please read this, you will understand what I'm talking about. So I'm just curious about whether the imaginative novelistic depiction of these themes is something that just comes out of your everyday interests in travel and reading and research and historical subject matter, or if you do specific research for this kind of...
I've often done a lot of research on for books in the past. For this one, no, I really didn't do much research at all. It just, except visiting the migrant camps and talking to the refugees. That was a very important part of the research. But the historical stuff and so on, no, I didn't. But yes, I mean, the part that you mentioned, Los Angeles. So I should explain that one of the scenes in this book is set in Los Angeles in a museum, the Getty Museum, though I don't actually name it. And suddenly there's a fire, a wildfire advancing towards the museum. And it has a big impact on everybody there. And as many of you will know, such an event actually occurred. There was a wildfire advancing very fast upon the Getty Museum. They had to evacuate, take away a lot of their holdings and so on. But the really strange part of it was that I wrote that chapter several months before the fire actually happened. It's one of the strange, uncanny things about our world today and about writing this book. I mean, all kinds of uncanny things have really unfolded around me. And even around Rajiv. I mean, I mentioned a song in this book, and he was listening to that song as he was reading that particular bit. So I mean, there's a lot of what Jung used to call synchronicity in the book. And I find this idea of synchronicity very interesting because of the ways, in which strange sorts of interconnections in time shape all of our lives in so many different ways.
So I think maybe we can take some questions from the audience. Are we ready for that?
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to turn up the house lights. Both myself and my colleague John will be walking around with mics. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. You can.
Hi, Dr. Ghosh. I went to your lecture in University of Chicago, and I read all of your novels. And it's so nice to be able to come and see you again. And how do you choose all of your subjects? It's so interesting. I learned about Indian subcontinent more after reading your novels. I'm a science student. I'm just a boring engineer. But you taught me about glass palace and all those opium wars. So how do you choose all those interesting subjects?
Well, thank you so much for that very generous comment. I mean, it's wonderful to know that my books have served some purpose in the world. In my case, I think often it's my family history that has led me to these stories. For example, the Glass Palace, which is set in Burma and in Southeast Asia, really grew out of, I had uncles who lived in Burma. My father fought in the Second World War in Burma. So, I had those connections. And I decided, actually, the Glass Palace, which is a novel, started as a kind of family history. But then suddenly it somehow veered off into completely novelistic territory. Similarly, my book, The Hungry Tide, both my parents came from families that, as was common in those days, there were lots of children. So I had many, many aunts, uncles, cousins, and so on. So the Hungry Tide, again, started with an uncle who lived and worked in the Sundarbun. So in one way or the other, I have to say I'm very grateful to my family for giving me so many stories. Thank you.
Okay, looks like we have one over here.
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Ghosh, after reading your trilogy books, in my family, we started speaking Anglo-Indian. Okay? Instead of saying tamasha, which is fun, we say, how's your tamashar?
Yes.
Okay? I have a quick question. Did you actually learn Italian for this book?
Yes, I did.
Thank you very much.
I should explain, though, that, I have a very old connection with Italy somehow. I mean, the two people to whom the book is dedicated are old friends of mine. Irene Biniardi is an old friend. She's a journalist, a writer, unfortunately now very, very ill with Parkinson's. And I've known her, for 35 years. When my first book came out in Italian, she interviewed me. And, Italians have such an incredible gift for friendship. So there have been these lifelong friendships. The other person to whom the book is dedicated is my Italian translator. who's been my translator now, again, for 35 years. So we have very close friendships. And so, in some way, visiting Italy quite often, I spoke a little bit of Italian anyway. But then when I started writing this book, simply because I was doing all this research there, I learned Italian. And I do feel that, when you're writing about a character, you need to know their language, So that's how it began.
There was another hand up over here, or there's two here, and lots now.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I know you kind of write a whole book addressing this, the Great Derangement, but talking more about why the humanities has sort of failed to fully address this crisis. And I feel like we've seen, the sciences, I see more and more scientists kind of become almost desperate, in trying to communicate the urgency, and almost this blurring of science and humanities and what those two kind of categories mean, and if there really is that much of a difference. If there's any sort of explicit ask or how we can kind of fully rise to this challenge through narrative and why that's important.
Thank you. Well, I think the basic problem begins with the very idea of the humanities, doesn't it? Because after all, it's precisely in this period, in the 17th century, that you have the emergence of the idea that the human is all that matters. Because never before, really, in human history have people thought about the world in that way, that humans matter more than anything else, that nothing else really exists, that animals are, unthinking robots, coming out of Descartes and so on. So I think really, in a way, there is a very fundamental commitment within the whole issue of the humanities, if you like, to a very sort of human-centered view of the world. And what we are seeing now, actually one of the really exciting things about this moment is we are seeing the world lashing out at us in so many different ways, uncontrollable ways that we can't even begin to imagine. In the US, the thing that really sort of seems to me so strange and uncanny is the spread of Lyme disease. How it's everywhere now, and you can't walk on the grass anymore. It's something that's almost kind of unimaginable, it's really that the non-human world is turning against us in such dramatic ways. So, yes, but at the same time, let me say that I think there has been a profound change within the humanities in the last 20 years. Within philosophy now, there's a whole branch of people, dealing with these issues. History, I think history has been so incredibly interesting. The way that now, we are just rereading so many periods of history, in light of climate issues and environmental issues. The most interesting work seems to me to be about the 17th century, which is also the period that you study. So, I think there is a very dramatic change underway, but I think, and I think maybe Prabha and Anita, you should insist that this festival's name be changed, and it made, from Humanities Festival, it goes to, All Beings Festival. Yes.
I would just like to add that the 17th century is, in fact, the best century.
Yes.
Right here in the middle.
Hi, thanks for being here. I really enjoyed this last book. I have to admit I haven't read the others, but one of the things that made me want to read it was tackling the climate change and the whole point of how local impacts global and global impacts local. So I don't know if you can talk about that from your perspective.
Sure. That's the real thing about what's happening in the world today. It's so insistently global. And, it's what Margaret Atwood says is that calling it climate change isn't enough. It's really everything change. Everything we see is changing around us, And I think that has to be true for literary practice as well. Because you consider, for example, I think the great model for writing about this period is actually John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, where he's writing similarly about an event that's connected with the environment, where really changes within the Dust Bowl force these people to move to California. And I love the form of that book, the way that, you have this old truck with these people inside and, moving across this landscape. It provides the Aristotelian unities, if you like, unity of time, place, and action, and so on. But, imagine trying to write a book like that today. What Steinbeck does to such great effect is that he uses the Oklahoma dialect. But today, if you were to write about the movements of agricultural workers, you would have to do it in Spanish. So it's in these ways that the world around us is changing so dramatically in ways that you can't use the literary practices of another time. Similarly, you think about those great Scandinavian classics about, the far north, Knut Hamsun writing The Growth of the Soil, and the great Icelandic writers and so on, again, using dialect often, registers of language. But today, if you go to that far north in Norway, who will you come across? You'll come across Eritreans, Syrians, Arabs, Sub-Saharan Africans, who've all been settled in those areas, of dense snow and so on. There again, we see actually this kind of use of language has to change. We can't write about these realities in the accustomed ways of monolingual narration. That's one of the reasons why in these books, most of all, I'm trying to confront this issue of how do you write about this, our insistently multilingual reality. That is one of the realities we have to face as writers today. And strangely, I come from a context, India, if you grow up in India, it is a completely multilingual world, and we've had to deal with this multilingual reality forever. Whereas American writers have been used to a completely monolingual practice.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. Mr. Ghosh, you're one of my all-time favorites.
Oh, thank you.
And I know that all your books are thoroughly researched. I have 2 short questions. First one, what's the average time of research for each book, and this one in particular?
As I said, this book is not so not as research invested as my earlier books. It's mainly just stuff that was already in my head. For the earlier books, especially the Ibis trilogy, that was monumental research, I have to say. Because actually that, for example, the Opium War, some aspects of it hadn't been researched at all. I mean, the military history of the Opium War, not much has been written about it. So that took a lot of work. But the research isn't separate from the writing. They go together for me. I do both of them together. Thank you very much, though, for that question. And there was a question back there, and there's one here. Maybe if we rush, we can do both.
I haven't had the opportunity to read your book yet, but I was wondering how you think the human condition and how we look at climate change and the world around us will change after we feel the effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I think in the first place, it's impossible to go on being as anthropocentric as we are. It's impossible to go on being as human-centered as we are. And that's one of the things that really interested me in this goddess of snakes figure. What she really represents is that she's like a voice of other beings on the planet. She's the voice of snakes, if you like, but also the voice of weather events. And what we are waking to now is a kind of uncanny reality, and that's what we're going to have to grapple with.
Over here.
Then there was one here.
Amitav, thank you so much for coming to Chicago and speaking to us. My last question, which I think is related to a lot of the questions that have been asked, is my favorite book by you is In an Antique Land, especially because I study Middle Eastern history, but I think more so because you bring out so vividly a kind of human experience that is not maybe featured in standard narratives of the Anthropocene or human life, especially because you're writing about this kind of transoceanic history, connections between people who have never been written about and may never be written again. And now, I think after having, in the wake of the Great Derangement and your ideas presented in those lectures, I'm wondering, how have your thoughts and perspectives on writing about humans and human kind of enmeshment with the environment changed over the course of your writing career? And what maybe lessons might you impart to us as writers, scholars, etc.?
Wow, that's, but thank you.
You've got 30 seconds.
I've got 30. Well, it's hard to, that's a very interesting and important question. Again, let me say that, when we think about the humanities and, for example, about history, remember that actually it wasn't that all humans were thought to have history. Basically, it was only certain number of white people in Europe were thought to have history-making powers, and that's absolutely at the heart of the foundation of the history as a subject. It may have moved away from that, but that was essentially the foundation of the subject. So who were the others who didn't have history? Because they didn't have history, they were brutes. And they could be exterminated, from which you get exterminate all the brutes, In the same way, this category of the brute is very interesting because it covers humans as well as other creatures, And if you think about what's happened in the writing of history in the last 30 years, it's really a process of the unbruting of the brutes. That's why I'm here, because, a few years ago, it's not so long ago that we would have been considered brutes, So we have to remember that all around us, there are others who are also, we consider brutes by using the very term, the humanities. And a time is coming when, just as you and I have been unbruted, those creatures and those beings will also be unbruted. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So.